This is the ASMR Snooze Network. This is news you can snooze to. So, if you listen to the media or the news in recent days, you would have heard a lot about Israel and Gaza, and you may not know what's been going on. So, I figured my first video, it could be kind of a educational plus news episode. So I have in front of me the BBC News app, and they have a nice sort of history of the Israel-Gaza conflict. So I thought I'd read this for you. So, how did it start? So this is 100-year-old issue. It started when Britain took control of the area known as Palestine after the ruler of that part of the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, was defeated in World War I. The land was inhabited by a Jewish minority and Arab majority. So tensions between the two people grew when the international community gave Britain the task of establishing a national home in Palestine for Jewish people. For Jews, it was their ancestral home, but Palestinian Arabs also claimed the land and opposed the move. Between the 1920s and 1940s, the number of Jews arriving there grew, with many fleeing from persecution in Europe and seeking a homeland after the Holocaust of World War II. Violence between Jews and Arabs and against British rule also grew. In 1947, the UN voted for Palestine to be split into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem becoming an international city. That plan was accepted by Jewish leaders and rejected by the Arab side and never implemented. So the creation of Israel and the catastrophe. In 1948, unable to solve the problem, British rulers left and Jewish leaders declared the creation of the State of Israel. Many Palestinians objected and a war followed. Troops from neighbouring Arab countries invaded. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were forced out of their homes in what they call our Nakba, or the catastrophe. By the time the fighting ended in a ceasefire the following year, Israel controlled most of the territory. Jordan occupied land which became known as the West Bank, and Egypt occupied Gaza. Jerusalem was divided between Israeli forces in the west and Jordanian forces in the east. Because there was never a peace agreement, each side blamed the other. There were more wars and fighting in the decades which followed. In another war in 1967, Israel occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank, as well as most of the Syrian Golan Heights and Gaza and the Egyptian Sunni Peninsula. Most Palestinian refugees and their descendants live in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as neighbouring Jordan, Syria and Lebanon. Neither they nor their descendants have been allowed by Israel to return to their homes. Israel says this would overwhelm the country and threaten its existence as a Jewish state. Israel still occupies the West Bank, and although it pulled out of Gaza, and the UN still regards that piece of land as part of occupied territory. Israel claims the whole of Jerusalem as its capital, while the Palestinians claims that East Jerusalem is their capital of a future Palestinian state. The US is one of only a handful of countries to recognize Israel's claim to the whole of the city. In the past 50 years, Israel has built settlements in these areas, where more than 600,000 Jews now live. Palestinians say these are illegal under international law and are objects to peace, but Israel denies this. So what's happening now? So tensions are often higher between Israel and Palestinians living in eastern Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank. So Gaza is ruled by a Palestinian militant group called Hamas, which has fought Israel many times. Israel and Egypt tightly control Gaza's borders to stop weapons getting to Hamas. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank say they are suffering because of Israeli actions and restrictions. Israel says it is only acting to protect itself from Palestinian violence. Things have escalated since the start of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan in mid-April 2021, with nightly clashes between police and Palestinians. The threatened eviction of some Palestinian families in East Jerusalem has also caused rising anger. So what are the main problems? There are a number of issues which Israel and the Palestinians cannot agree on. These include what should happen to Palestinian refugees, whether Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank should stay or be removed, whether the two sides should share Jerusalem, and perhaps most strictly of all, for a Palestinian state should be created alongside Israel. So peace talks have been taking place on and off for more than 25 years, but so far have not solved the conflict. So what does the future hold? In short, the situation isn't going to be sorted out anytime soon. The most recent peace plan prepared by the United States when Donald Trump was president, called the Deal of the Century by Israeli Prime Minister, has been dismissed by the Palestinians as one-sided and never got off the ground. Any future peace deal will need both sides to agree to resolve complex issues. Until that happens, the conflict will continue. So this was a story on the BBC News. So I hope that sheds some light on the current situation, and hopefully the violence will end shortly and no more lives will be lost. So this has been the first video for the ASMR Snooze Network. This is news you can snooze to. Thank you for listening. Good night.